Thank you very much for being here today. My name is Stephen Fagin. I'm curator at the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And to mark our special exhibit, A Time for Greatness, the 1960 Kennedy Campaign, we're offering a series of gallery talks related to the 1960 election. And today it's my great pleasure to talk about an event that occurred right here in Dallas, just a few blocks away, which may have ultimately handed Kennedy the election by just a very fine margin. And it's a really interesting story, and I hope you feel the same way. It happened November 4th, 1960, just 4 days before the election. It was another busy day for the candidates, especially in the state of Texas. Vice President Richard Nixon was in Fort Worth that morning, speaking to a crowd of approximately 10,000 people at Burnett Park. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic vice presidential nominee, spoke at Arlington, Texas in a shopping center and then headed into downtown Dallas. So busy day in Texas, in the Dallas area for these folks. Now, Dallas was to be just a straightforward campaign stop, a 12:15 luncheon at the Adolphus Hotel before LBJ would head on to Houston and then to Beaumont, Texas. But that brief visit to downtown Dallas proved to be one of the most lively stops on the 1960 campaign trail. Johnson's visit coincided with a Republican event downtown designated Tag Day, in which all of these female volunteers that you see in the picture here handed out these pro-Nixon buttons and solicited funds throughout the city. This was a 2-day event sanctioned by the Nixon campaign. It had been organized way back in July, prior to Lyndon Johnson arranging his Adolphus luncheon. And it actually involved several hundred volunteers divided into 28 different teams, each one with a captain. This was a very serious event for Republicans in Dallas. The uniform that these ladies wore consisted of a red hat, a white blouse, and a red vest with Nixon Lodge on the back, almost like a bumper sticker. You can kind of see it in those pictures there, and a dark blue skirt. It was a very patriotic red, white, and blue outfit, and actually not really dissimilar from the Kennedy-Johnson uniforms that their female volunteers wore. So with Johnson's downtown arrival scheduled right in the middle of the lunchtime Tag Day excitement, it was inevitable that there would be some type of clash. Certainly, a few of the more zealous Republican officials thought that a demonstration was definitely in order, led primarily by Congressman Bruce Alger. And Alger's in one of these photographs. I'm going to point him out if I can real quick. Here is Alger right now, Republican congressman, actually the first Republican congressman from Texas since Reconstruction. And so it began. 1 hour into their Tag Day activities, many of the young volunteers took a break from their button distribution, along with plenty of male admirers and other party leaders. And they began to wave these critical signs and chant, "We want Nixon," right as the Johnsons arrived at the hotel. You can see lots of really creative slogans on these signs, some of which may not, you might not really understand. This thing here, "Remember Duval County, Box 13," that was actually a reference to Lyndon Johnson's 1948 Senate race, in which there was some question of voter fraud, specifically Duval County, specifically Box 13. So this individual's reminding folks that way back in the late 40s, Lyndon Johnson had some issues with the proper counting of votes. The one up at the very top there, "Please, Lyndon, can you get me a TV station too?" That's actually in reference to Austin station KTBC, radio and television, which was a station that Lady Bird Johnson had purchased way back in the 40s. It was the source of the Johnsons' personal wealth, and it was rumored, particularly at the time around the 1960 election, that Johnson had used some of his Senate ties to make lucrative deals with the FCC and CBS, and so that's what that young lady is talking about there. The other signs are typically talking about how Johnson was politically flexible. He was a Southern Democrat, to be sure, but after the death of Franklin Roosevelt, who was really a mentor to Johnson, he sort of moved right and left as needed within the Democratic Party. So he was straddling platforms. I think this one says it best: conservative, liberal, socialist, nothing. So some very Very serious signs greeting Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson that day. They arrived by motorcade, here's a picture of that, to find between 300 and 400 hecklers at the intersection of Commerce and Ackerd Streets in downtown Dallas as the Johnsons retreated into the Baker Hotel across the street from the Adolphus to freshen up. A young Tag Day volunteer grabbed Mrs. Johnson's gloves and threw them in the gutter. The party hurried into the hotel and went immediately to the elevators. Johnson paused just long enough to say to the demonstrators, "I hope you all don't act like this all the time." He then said something about freedom of expression, which was completely drowned out by all the chanting. The crowd swelled during the excitement, including what the Dallas Morning News later described as, quote, riffraff from the nearby beer parlors and some of the lower-class restaurants, end quote. Now, in retrospect, that assessment is pure media speculation, not established fact. In fact, no other media outlet besides the Dallas Morning News ever made such a claim. But 15 minutes passed with the Johnsons inside the Baker Hotel, and during that time, Johnson did some quick thinking. The political wheels were turning, and with that huge crowd of demonstrators outside, this felt like an opportunity. Now, multiple versions of the story say that before heading back downstairs, Lyndon Johnson firmly refused police protection. And then he further declined recommendations that he and Lady Bird enter the Adolphus through a side door and bypass the mob outside. Before exiting the Baker Hotel, Johnson told his entourage not to shove or to engage with the demonstrators. Exiting the elevators, they started walking across Commerce Street. It was a 50-yard trek, and it took 30 minutes. That seems like an exaggeration, but every media account emphasizes that time frame. It should have taken about 5 minutes. The fact is that Lyndon Johnson slowed to a crawl. Whether this was just for dramatic effect or the result of pushing and crowding, it's in the eye of the beholder. But he didn't seem to be in any hurry. The late Jerry Bartos, who later served on the Dallas City Council in the 80s, he was a curious young Republican in 1960, and he went down to see Lyndon Johnson. In an oral history that he gave our museum several years ago, he said he was taken aback and a little ashamed as a Dallasite of the way the Johnsons were treated. Now, the Johnsons were led through the crowd by Dallas law enforcement, in particular, a Dallas police detective named Elmer Boyd, who I've circled in this picture. Now, Elmer Boyd, just over 3 years later, would be the primary handler of Lee Harvey Oswald on the evening of November 22nd, 1963. But back on November 4th, 1960, Boyd was leading the Johnson security detail in Dallas. Now, in his oral history, he said, "They just all came down with these signs, and they spit on Lady Bird Johnson. I thought we were fixing to have a riot." Protesters clogged the doorway and the hallways leading to the ballroom where John Tower, the Republican who was seeking Johnson's Senate seat, shouted at him from 6 feet away. Johnson ignored Tower, and he largely ignored the crowd. He just kept smiling and holding on to Lady Bird's arm or her shoulder. At one point, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out his comb, and he loudly said, "Bird, are you all right?" And he handed her his comb. But when the press, this is interesting, when the press asked Lady Bird for a comment, Johnson just sort of gently put his hand over her mouth. He didn't want her to say anything. Now, among the hostile crowd was Congressman Bruce Alger, we saw a minute ago. He was later deemed the man most responsible for the demonstration. He had a sign that read, as you may have seen in a slide earlier, "LBJ sold out to Yankee socialists." Alger later claimed that he was not present for any of the pushing or the shoving, but he did tell the jubilant crowd that he wanted to demonstrate that the Senate Majority Leader was not welcome in the city of Dallas. Now, some conflicting reports have Alger's supporters hissing at or spitting on the Johnsons as they made their way across the street. One of Johnson's aides said later that she was kicked, hit, stuck with pins, and cursed at by the angry protesters. A news report published just a day after the incident said that many of the participants and spectators were elbowed, skinned, jarred, and literally crushed, but the only casualty was Lady Bird Johnson's hair. Now, in all fairness to Mrs. Johnson, she was said to be on the verge of tears, and you can kind of see how upset she is in some of these photographs while her husband is pretty much smiling behind her. There was one sign that particularly bothered her that said, "Let's ground Ladybird." It's worth noting that inside the Adolphus, Dallas police had apparently opened up this unobstructed path to the ballroom. But they were told either by Johnson or by representatives of the campaign to stand down and to not block the demonstrators. And so that just left a couple of detectives like Elmer Boyd assigned to Johnson's security detail. So these few law enforcement officials stuck close to Johnson as assigned, but they had no way to hold back the crowd. So it was widely reported at the time and in the many years since that Johnson had turned down police protection. But as we see, this was only partially true. He kept his escort, but then he insisted that all the crowd control stand down. Inside the Adolphus's grand ballroom, a crowd of 2,000 cheering supporters greeted the Johnsons. Texas Attorney General Will Wilson introduced the candidate by emphasizing that the raucous demonstration outside did not reflect the true spirit of Dallas. Mrs. Johnson was introduced as one of the greatest campaigners of all time, but after cordially receiving her applause, she immediately left the luncheon, followed by a few curious reporters, and she went straight to the Adolphus beauty salon to get her hair fixed. Now, it's certainly possible, or even likely, that this was all staged by the Johnson people just to emphasize how poorly Lady Bird Johnson had been treated, that she had to ostensibly skip her lunch in order to get an emergency hair appointment. Now, trapped in the beauty salon by reporters, she was asked to comment on the mob scene she had just experienced, and she said in classic Lady Bird style, "I could be very articulate, but I will pretend you didn't ask me." Now, meanwhile, back in the ballroom, Lyndon Johnson referred to the incident in his prepared remarks. Think about that for a moment. Saying that he refused to use a different entrance simply to find out if the time had come when he couldn't walk with his lady through the corridors of Dallas hotels. And he then begins to establish the narrative that he turned down police protection. And so it went. Johnson referred to the situation again and again. He did it during a televised interview in Houston the next day, and he told a crowd of supporters in South Texas, "I thought of what the good book says, forgive them, O Lord, they know not what they do." In short, this was all political gold for the Kennedy-Johnson ticket. Over the next few days, that Adolphus incident became Johnson's go-to talking point, lamenting this terrible display of Republican extremism and repeatedly noting that he felt like he was in a different country. Now, this whole felt like a different country bit is another great example of the Johnson narrative sort of taking hold of the situation. Within just 24 hours of the incident at the Adolphus, the Democrats were circulating these handbills with a big picture of Congressman Bruce Alger on it, and the caption read, "Dallas, not Venezuela." And this was a sly reference to Vice President Nixon's rocky visit to Caracas in 1958 when demonstrators had almost turned his car over protesting anti-American protests. So what this was a really remarkable, clever way of accusing all Republican demonstrators of being anti-American, but without actually saying so. The story gained national news attention, particularly in Dallas. You see Alger there in the picture holding his LBJ sign. The Dallas Morning News, considered the more conservative of the city's two daily newspapers, initially described the scene as 45 minutes of Republican bedlam that was the nearest thing to an uncontrolled mob Dallas had witnessed since the wilder days of the Texas OU football game. But this story had legs, and it quickly gained national notoriety, which surprised and apparently alarmed the Dallas Morning News, whose editorial page had very enthusiastically endorsed Nixon for president. Within 48 hours, the paper had received over 100 telegrams about the Adolphus incident, most but not all condemning the actions of the demonstrators. Newspapers across the country devoted their Sunday morning editorials to the event. For many, the most unconscionable act was this mussing of Lady Bird Johnson's hair. You simply did not, under any circumstances, attack the wife of a politician, especially in the genteel South. And it certainly appears that Johnson built this into the handling of events from the beginning, loudly asking Lady Bird if she was okay, handing her his comb, and then having her skip her lunch to go to the beauty salon to get her hair fixed. You know, if this happened in the 2016 news cycle, this would be called Hairgate, and we would argue about it for days on end with commentators talking about, was her hair messed up? I don't think it was messed up. They'd be comparing photographs, but this, then as now, this would have been a major campaign issue. Letters to the editor poured into the news, many of which were printed in the paper. "Switch one Nixon vote to Kennedy," wrote one Dallasite. Another suggested, if apologies are in order, let Lyndon be the first to speak. And one of the Tag Day volunteers wrote, "LBJ deserves a lot worse than he got." Now, nationally, the Johnson version, exaggerated though it was, took hold in the public consciousness. This was our nation's Senate Majority Leader refusing police protection, courageously pushing his way through an uncontrollable mob of violent extremists while protecting his good lady wife. Johnson aide Bill Moyers said, "The moment it happened, he knew." Unquestionably, the Adolphus incident aided the Kennedy campaign across the South. Influential Georgia Senator Richard Russell, who later incidentally served on the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination, he had disagreed with the Kennedy campaign on civil rights and other issues. But after the Adolphus story, Russell proclaimed his public support for Johnson and Kennedy and then took to the stump during the final few days of the final push. And this was extremely important throughout the South to have Richard Russell on board with the Kennedy-Johnson ticket. Republican forces fought back against what was becoming a growing PR nightmare. John Tower, the guy who had shouted at Johnson's face from 6 feet away, put out this statement: "The Nixon ladies were spirited but orderly. It was the Johnson people, led by some huge men, who got mad and started all that pushing and shoving." And then he added, "Senator and Mrs. Johnson were impeccably groomed when they entered that ballroom." Again, Hairgate. The morning news started to backpedal a little bit on their original account of events. They were softening some of the sensationalism. One of the reporters that co-wrote that original story offered a more personal account 2 days later under this headline, "Crowd Orderly, Reporter Feels." She wrote that the crowd was only a mob in that too many people were packed into too small of a place. There was no fear of any injury, she said, while adding that she personally did not witness any indignity towards Mrs. Johnson. She added that Senator Johnson could have avoided the entire scene had he just accepted police advice and entered the Adolphus through a side door. Eyewitness Jerry Bartos, we heard from earlier, he also said later that he did not witness any spitting. He simply described menacing gestures up very, very close. And he felt certain that Mrs. Johnson was genuinely afraid. You'll also notice that in these various pictures we see, we don't see any actual evidence of spitting or hitting or people being stuck with pins. Now, on Election Day, November 8th, the Morning News bluntly told its readers that it would be unfair to base one's vote on the isolated incident at the Adolphus Hotel. It reminded voters that, quote, "maturity of judgment and restraint in manners break down easily in America when the campaign is at white heat. Today, let us go calmly to the polls and vote not our wrath, but our hopes and prayers for a better world, a better America, a better Texas, and a better Dallas." It's impossible to say if this one incident on a downtown Dallas street gave Kennedy the state of Texas and ultimately gave him the entire election by a hair, but its timing, at least for the Democrats, was perfect. According to one reporter writing a full month after the 1960 election, there was considerable anti-Dallas sentiment around the country from both Republicans who felt that the city got carried away and spoiled the election, and from Democrats who reinforced this impression that Dallas was angry and inhospitable. And it was all about perception in the end, even if Johnson exaggerated the ferocity of the mob for political advantage, which he surely did. Minutes after the ordeal, just minutes, Will Wilson, the Texas Attorney General, bluntly told the press, "Maybe this is for the good. It's going to get us votes." But it did more than that. It planted a seed that blossomed 3 years later as Dallas the City of Hate. In late October 1963, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson was heckled at Memorial Auditorium during a speech. In this photo, we see the man pointing there is local activist Frank McGehee, founder of a colorfully named conservative organization, the National Indignation Convention. He's being called out by law enforcement officials here. McGehee had stood up, interrupted Stevenson's speech, repeatedly shouting questions at him, while a number of his associates peppered the crowd and began to blow noisemakers and interrupt the speech even further. Outside, 100 demonstrators had gathered, and leaving the auditorium, Ambassador Stevenson was spit on and hit over the head with a sign. A film of the incident appeared on the Today Show and the CBS Evening News. Vividly, it was described on ABC Radio, and there was a now famous photograph, which you can actually see down on the 6th floor, of Stevenson at the moment he was struck by the sign, and it was prominently published in Time magazine. All in all, it was an eerily familiar scene in Dallas. Within a week of the Stevenson attack in October of '63, the Dallas City Council passed an anti-harassment ordinance which specifically protected visiting speakers. Naturally, Congressman Bruce Alger spoke out against the ordinance, but it passed regardless. It was clearly a direct result of the 1960 incident at the Adolphus and the 1963 incident at Memorial Auditorium with Adlai Stevenson, but it was also looking ahead to yet another major political visit to Dallas, scheduled for Friday, November 22nd, 1963. Johnson in 60, Stevenson in 63, they would become forever intertwined in the annals of Dallas history. Though separated by almost 3 years, it was as if they were two parts of the same prologue to the assassination of President Kennedy. Both of these demonstrations were referenced in the global press hundreds of times in the aftermath of the president's death, highlighting what many considered Dallas's toxic political atmosphere, an angry environment where extremism thrived. And that reputation would hang as a dark cloud over Dallas for a long, long time. What is most interesting, though, about the frequent referencing of the Adolphus incident in the aftermath of the Kennedy assassination is that few, if any, of the media reports and commentaries made note of the true irony of the situation, that a politically charged incident a few blocks from Dealey Plaza in November of 1960 maybe, just maybe, led to a narrow election victory that, after a fashion, brought President Kennedy right back to Dallas, to Dealey Plaza, almost exactly 3 years later as he kicked off his 1964 re-election campaign. Are there any questions? All right, please check out our exhibit, A Time for Greatness, the 1960 Kennedy Campaign, and I want to thank you all for visiting the 6th Floor Museum today. Have a great day, folks.